What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Axioms on Trial. I'm going to do my best to shut up and keep it sweet and short as possible. Cease, how are you doing today, brother?
Good. How about you?
I'm doing good. I'm really happy to be in my house and not on the road right now, but but that's a completely different conversation that me and Cease are. We were hoping to get on a little earlier. That's my fault, and that's the reason. But we're here now, and hopefully we can bring you some good content. Hopefully, this brings something to your life. For us, we love talking about these things. Hopefully, as the viewer, you have some kind of reason that you're here. And if you are actually in a position of maybe where you've lost your faith, or you're in a position of where you're losing your faith, or you just are genuinely interested in these questions or know somebody, look out to the Clergy Project for people who are higher up within that. Then we also have Recovering from Religion as well. So reach out to those organizations. That all said, tonight we have Colton on, who is a Catholic. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him in, and hopefully we can just kind of, maybe you can give us something, your favorite sport, your religion, all those kinds of things, and just give us a little bit about yourself.
Cool. All right, so I'm not that interesting, but I'm 20 years old. I'm a college student. I'm a Catholic Christian. I play basketball. That's kind of like my thing, and I study theology, and that's about it, man. That's just who I am. So,
yeah, I think there's a good common thread between the three of us that we. I mean, I don't want to make assumptions, but I think we all want to know things that are true. We don't want to just go through life and believe something that's not true or whatnot. So I think the common thread between us is that that is the same exact passion, potentially at different conclusions. And so that's what we're here to do, is to talk about that and see kind of where maybe we diverge. We're going to keep this between Cease and Colton today. I'm going to pass it on over to Cease here now. If you didn't already, go check out the conversation I had with Dr. Marcos the other, I don't even know how many days ago it was, but it's our last video. Go check that out. Tomorrow we have Gag Burrito on, who is a Christian, who's a friend of mine. We've chatted on the Atheist Roundtable, and then T-Jump potentially joins us on Friday to discuss some things about how he talks with certain people, and then as well as a little pushback potentially from Cease and him about moral philosophies. And so
I'm very excited.
I'm very excited too. I'm going to shut up now and give it to you, Cease. I've rambled enough, but yes, I'm excited for this. Again, I get to be an audience member, so take it away, brother.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate your time. So I guess the first thing I'll ask is a little bit more about, what it is that you believe and why you believe it. So what is your evidence for God? What is your evidence particularly for the Christian God? And then, once we go through that, maybe we can talk about the moral aspect of it, because I think you and I first interacted on that question, where, if I remember correctly, you had said something along the lines of, without God to ground morality, you don't have objective moral truth. And that's something that I would like to push back on a little bit. So, just go ahead.
Okay, so I guess I'll just lay out some arguments. So let's tackle this question of whether or not God exists from a philosophical, metaphysical standpoint. All right, so I'm just going to ask some questions and hopefully logically show that these answers to the questions lead to a cause of the universe, which has the traditional divine attributes, or most people call God, what I call God. And by the way, these proofs and arguments I'm going to give you might not be automatically convincing. The way the Catholic Church defines it in the teachings proper to St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle is that the existence of God is available to natural reason. This does not mean God's revelation is easy to understand or discover. It's quite challenging, in fact, but nonetheless, it is accessible, and that is a result of God's loving nature and his desire for a relationship with each and every person. Okay, so I'll just ask the first question. Does the universe have an explanation for its existence? We know some objects in the universe are contingent, or the universe must be explained by something else. You go outside, you see a brick wall, and without even thinking about it, you already know it has a builder. Same thing with technological devices, such as the computer I'm talking through right now. It exists because of factory production and power sources. All these things are contingent, or they don't explain their own existence. They need a designer, or they must be explained by something else. So how do we explain these different things? One way would be to pause at an infinite chain of contingent things, explaining each other, but that doesn't explain why the whole series of things exist. You can maybe say that an object's existence doesn't need explanation, but this would go against the principle of sufficient reason. It says that things need existence for why they exist, or they need a reason for why they exist. I mean, you can maybe say that an object's existence doesn't need explanation, but like I said, it goes against principle of sufficient reason. And we believe this principle to be true because if it were false, then things would pop up into existence without a cause. But we do not observe this in nature. Science relies on PSR being true because otherwise we can never rule out the conclusion that these things we observe simply have no reason to why they exist. And without PSR, we couldn't explain negative states of affairs. I'm asked the question, how do you have such good hair? But it doesn't make sense right now to ask, why isn't your hair on fire? However, it would make sense to ask that if a flamethrower was hitting your scalp and your hair remained unscathed. Both cases presuppose that things which exist must have reasons for why they exist, and they don't exist for no reason at all. But the explanation for the contingent things we observe cannot be another contingent thing. So it must be something beyond the universe or the entire collection of contingent things that explains why everything exists. So that was my first question to ask.
Oh, okay. I'm just writing this down. So you're asking me what I would say to that?
Well, you said you wanted to respond to each one I had to say.
Okay.
So that was the first one. So I'll just allow you to respond.
Sure. Okay. So a number of things. The first is that the argument from design is based on a fallacious argument, because I'm trying to think of where to start here. You can look at a clock, right, and say that it's designed because you understand what a clock is. But to assume that organic matter has to function in the same way that artificial things do is a mistake. So a clock was made in what was it? I forget the exact date, but regardless, let's say 17th century. I might be completely wrong, but just as a number. And it is complex.
I think the wristwatch was 19th century, but the pocket watch was way earlier than that. So
right.
Just look.
So the fact that two things can share an attribute, like complexity, for example, doesn't mean that they share all attributes. Because you would never say, for example, that the universe was created in the 17th century. So that's one of. Can you guys hear me okay? So that is why one of the reasons why I think that approach is fallacious, because you're assuming that if two things share a quality, they must share all qualities, which is a non sequitur. In addition, we don't see things coming to existence. This is a just not what we see in nature. We see change in matter, but we never see something coming to existence. We see things that are already there. We see cause and effect. But it would be like saying, I can agree that the flocks, the sheep in a flock, all have a mother. Each sheep has a mother, but you wouldn't say that the flock as a whole has to have a mother. I think this is called I forget the name of this particular fallacy. Mike would know it. I think it's a division of composition fallacy, something along those lines. But as far as I agree with you that things have an explanation, regardless of whether or not we can access that explanation. So I'm with you on that front. But I don't think the explanation that makes sense is to talk about anything existing outside of space and time. Like, for example, the fact that people say God would exist outside of the universe. Because the term existence implies space and time to begin with, as a feature of existence. So in what linguistic sense does it make sense to say something can exist outside of space and time when existence requires space, requires time? As far as what you said about things popping into existence, we, in a way, actually see that in physics. Now, I don't understand it exactly, and I think there may be some philosophical issues with that to a degree. But we do observe particles coming in and out of existence. Now, I agree that there's an explanation for that, and that to some degree, I think our intuitions about cause and effect are probably mistaken in some way. But yeah, so I think you're assuming a little bit too much there. Can you?
Okay, should I move on to the next one?
Yeah, let me just make sure, because I just got a message. Can you guys see me okay? Anybody listening? Can you guys see me all right? I'm waiting for whoever's in the stream to respond, because Mike is saying that he's having some issues. Actually, he can hear me, but he's having issues seeing me on the screen.
It's good on my end.
Here, hold on. But I'll just wait. I'll just wait, and if it's, if I have to restart the broadcast, we will. But yeah. So that would be I think they're fine. So that would be my first response to that is that you're assuming that because certain things within the universe have a cause, that the universe itself must have a cause. And then when it comes to God,
because it's a collection of contingent things.
Yes, but that doesn't necessarily suggest that the universe as a whole must have a cause. It would be like saying, well, it also depends on what you mean by contingent. I think, how would I say this? It's special pleading to say. Sorry, what?
I said, well, things are contingent, or their existence must be explained by something else. That's what I mean by that.
Yeah, but I guess I'm not sure that suggests. Well, one, I'm not sure that I would agree that the universe as a whole has to be contingent. It may be that it just.
Well, if it's a collection of contingent things, it would have to be.
Perhaps.
Here, let's go into the next question. I might answer your concerns. All right. So, does the universe explain its own existence? No, because then it would be a necessary thing, or something that has to exist by its very nature. But there are no reasons to believe it's necessary, and in fact, many reasons to believe it's not. For example, why is that square green prompts an intelligible answer, whereas the question, why does that square have four sides, merely deserves the answer, well, it just does, because it's a square, and a square has four sides. But the question, why does the universe exist, does not deserve the same retort, because it's a universe, and existence is not a necessary property of universes. It's more like the former question, why is that square green? It warrants an explanation beyond the thing that needs to be explained. There are two other factors about our universe that count against it having a necessary existence: its property of change and its finite past. Change occurs when a potential X becomes an actual Y. This can involve intrinsic change like growth or extrinsic change like motion, but potential X can't become an actual Y on its own any more than water can freeze itself or a train car can move itself. Something like a freezer would allow for the change of the state in the water, or a locomotive would have to actualize the potential for change in the train car. But of course, those actualizers only change because something else actualized their potential for change. This is why an infinite series cannot explain this type of change, just as an infinitely long train of boxcars would sit motionless without a locomotive. An infinite number of things that must be actualized by something else would be changeless, unless there was a cause of the series that is just pure actuality, no potential. And since the universe contains a mixture of potential and actual, it is not the pure actual cause we're looking for. We know the universe has a finite past and cannot be infinite. Since it had a beginning, the universe came into existence, and if it came into existence, then it can't be necessary. It would instead stand in need of an explanation for why it exists. And this explanation would have to be an uncaused cause. This explanation is necessary, or it explains its own existence. It is uncaused because it is the source of all causes, and it's pure actuality because it is the source of all change and motion in the universe. So that's my second one. You can go ahead and respond.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of assumptions being made about what the universe is. I think you're confusing the sort of the content of a thing for its whole. One, in terms of necessary, I think is problematic to begin with, because I think necessity is a term found in logic. Logic is descriptive, not prescriptive. We come to using logic as secondary to our experience of the world and the way our minds are structured. It's not that logic exists on its own without that without our sort of framework through which we created. I don't accept the premise that the existence of the universe, that you can know the existence of the universe isn't necessary.
Well, just explain why.
But I'm not sure that I follow that. It may be the case that there are things within the universe that are caused by other things, but the existence of the universe itself, this is going back to the flock example. It may be true that each sheep has a mother, but not that the entire flock has a mother. It may be true that things within the universe, we can talk about those things using cause and effect, which, by the way, there's another set of problems that comes along with that, because when you look at modern physics, you find that our notions of cause and effect are actually somewhat misleading. If you, and I think I may have given this example on the podcast before, but usually when we think about cause and effect, we think about it this way. You drop a glass, you see the glass shatter, and the sequence of events that we can sort of conceptualize is me dropping the glass is the cause, and the effect of that action is the glass shattering. But what we see in physics is that if we go back and if we sort of replay that tape backwards, so from the shattering to the glass coming back together, actually no law of physics is broken in that context. And so the way that in which I've had this sort of phenomenon explained to me is that, past, the present, and the future exist the way that chapters in a book exist. They all exist, just in a different space and time. So you wouldn't say that. So this idea that the past, for example, is gone, and the future is to come, is actually not what physics is telling us. They all exist, and what we experience as conscious entities is sort of the playing out of the story. But each chapter is already there.
So you agree? So you would agree with like Einstein and Newton and Descartes on their ideas of determinism?
Yeah. I mean, well, I have some issues with Descartes but it seems to me, I don't like the idea of everything being determined. Didn't Heisenberg debunk all that though? No. Heisenberg introduced the uncertainty principle, which again, this is not so much my field, but what he introduces is sort of an epistemic problem where there are certain, as far as I understand it, and again, I would have to get my mind refreshed on this, but I think what he's introducing is that when you look at the position of a particle, you don't know something about the time, and when you know the time, exactly. You don't know the. So, but that's not undermining anything Einstein said. It's well, no,
it does though because the idea of determinism is that they believe that we could understand everything in the universe. We could have total knowledge of the universe if we knew the exact placement of every single atom at every single moment. But Heisenberg came in and said we do not know where an electron is at a certain moment of time, and in fact, electron can even be at different times simultaneously, right? So just with that uncertainty principle, we know that because of our past, we cannot determine our future. And there is, in some sense, free will. I'm not saying that there is free will in what I believe, but there is in some sense free will, is what I'm trying to say. And Heisenberg came and I want to say, not undermined Einstein, but came in with a new idea that kind of throws out their ideas out the window.
No, this is simply not the case. I would urge you to look back at the first episode of the podcast where I have a quantum physicist, I think he actually deals with general relativism, where he's actually clears some of these misconceptions up, because that's actually not the case. It's the quantum mechanics is not claiming that the universe is not deterministic. The problem is an epistemic one, to where what we can know about this deterministic universe. It's not suggesting that the universe itself is not deterministic. It's saying that there is a limitation in our ability to get a certain answers. But it's not. It's even this idea of a particle can be at two places at the same time. It's a misconception of what the theory is actually saying. It's, you know, I would urge everyone here in this conversation right now to go back to the first episode, because he responds to this in a way that I think is better than I can. I would just say that Heisenberg didn't undermine Einstein. He just, what he's talking about is an epistemic limitation, not a claim about the nature of the universe. We can't determine both features of the particle in an epistemic sense. That's not to say that the particle isn't determined. It's a different thing. As far as, you know, what your original point about the universe being caused, I'm not convinced that the existence of the universe itself can't be the uncaused cause. I'm not even sure.
I gave reasons against that.
No, I'm responding
point.
to that, and I'm responding to that now.
Yeah.
Is I'm not sure the connection between things within the universe needing a cause and the universe itself as a whole, as a totality, needing a cause. The same way that
So why would a universe full of contingent things, full of potential and actual things, right, not need a cause?
The same
why would
way,
a universe not need a cause?
Right. So and I'm not saying that I'm convinced either way.
No, I hear you. I just want to get your perspective.
So in this context, for the same reason why you can look at, like I said earlier, you can look at a flock of sheep and say that, yes, each sheep in the flock has a mother, has come into existence from another sheep. But the concept of flock, the flock itself, doesn't need a mother for it to exist. It's that kind of concept. So the sheep within the flock need a cause, but the flock itself doesn't. Now, it may be the case that the universe might need a cause, or it might be the case that the universe has always been. But again, I understand, by that I don't mean an infinite regress of time, but I mean, imagine a circle, right? You wouldn't say that a circle has any one beginning point. It simply exists as it does. When we look at we look at physics, I don't think that what's being said is that, again, having had the physicist on in the first episode, is that when we get to the Big Bang, we recognize that the laws of physics as we understand them start to break down. And it seems as though time as we understand it came into existence in that point. But that's more so than time coming into existence. It seems like we just can't comment on what came before the Big Bang. We don't even know if it makes sense to ask that question, given the context of what physics is suggesting. And I look at the universe the way that I like I said, I look at the concept of a circle, where it exists. How do I say this? What sense would it make to talk about nothingness, to talk about non-existence? It just seems like conceptually that is something that doesn't have any intrinsic.
There's really no such thing.
Right. So it may be the case that may be what is meant by necessary. That the universe simply exists because it necessarily has to.
Well, I just gave logical arguments based on metaphysics and philosophy to believe that the universe is not necessary, and because it's not necessary, that means then it wouldn't have to be here. So if it didn't have to be here, then it came into existence.
So again, I feel like I, at least to some degree, have responded to why I don't think that's the case. But let's say that I was to agree with your premise, which again, I think the flock example shows why you can't derive that more general cause.
The flock is just a concept. It's just a concept. It's not an actual physical thing.
Well, it's a physical
the universe
thing.
The universe is a physical thing. It's a collection of contingent things. So it would have to have a cause to move the contingent thing. I mean, maybe I'm talking past you in this sense.
And the thing is, even if I was to somehow accept that the universe wasn't necessary, which again, I'm not sure why contingent things within the universe would suggest the universe itself to not be necessary. I'm not sure that I see the connection there. I don't see how you get from the universe needing a cause to that cause being God, especially when the God we see in the Bible is a God that acts within space and time, that supposedly experiences things within space and time. So
these arguments are not even for the Christian God. They're just for a transcendent monotheistic being, right? That's out of space and time,
right? But even when we think of minds, for example, we have no experience of mind independent of brains, of something physical. Even if you want to say that the consciousness is not necessarily dependent, or not dependent, but reducible to brains, which again, I'm a physicalist, so I do think ultimately it is. But even if you were to say that it's not, there's no context that, at least that as far as we know and we've experienced and studied, of mind, the way people talk about it religiously, in religious terms, independent from the physical, from brains. So even then, I mean, even forgetting the Christian God for a second, I don't see good reason to one, assume that necessity exists outside of a human concept, and two, that this cause can somehow be immaterial, but then cause the material into coming into existence. I mean, this results in something called the mind-body problem, which is you have to explain how something non-physical can interact with the physical, and you would have to explain what it would mean, linguistically speaking, to say that something that can exist outside of space and time, and then give cause to space and time, and give cause to the physical. It just seems like a leap there conceptually on a number of different ways that I think is problematic. That's how I think I would respond to that. I don't know if I'm making sense.
I hear you. So the arguments that I am laying out are arguments for a transcendent source, right? That has the divine attributes of God, right? So based on these logical arguments, all these logical arguments that I'm about to lay out, there's probably like 8 or 9, right? It gets down to this idea that there has to be a certain cause, right? I'm not saying that it's the Christian God, but a certain cause that is out of space and time. So can I continue for the next one? Yeah. And then you can maybe respond. It's a quick one. All right. Let's see. So is this cause changeable? No, and for 2 reasons. First, change only happens when potential is reduced to actual, but this cause is pure actuality, as showed in the previous argument. So therefore, it can't change. Secondly, since causal chains are finite, there can't be an infinite series of events. Change is a series of events, so the first cause must be changeless.
Yeah, so again, I'm not one of those people who believes in the sort of infinite regress, although I don't actually see why if an infinite regress is an impossibility.
So are you saying the universe being eternal?
Yeah. Again, I'm not saying that I personally believe that necessarily. I'm saying that I haven't seen a good argument as to why this is somehow logically impossible. But even besides that point, again, I refer to what I said earlier, that I don't think it actually makes linguistic sense to claim that you can have a cause, or you can have something existing outside of space and time, because existence requires space and time, which is why I think that
Well, of course, in my belief, right, God is existence, right? God is the essence of existence. At one single moment, He is simultaneous eternal existence, right? So when you talk about existence from a naturalistic, materialistic standpoint, right, you believe that being in time and space is being in existence. Of course, with me, right, I'm showing logical arguments to say that God is outside of space and time, and there needs to be a cause outside of space and time to move the universe into motion.
I don't think that you're showing that logically. I think what you're making is a linguistic mistake. Definitions are what they are. Like, even if it's the case that even the idea of creating something implies time, as far as I understand it. Even if you were to say that maybe, or even if there was something beyond our comprehension in this context, we couldn't access it. We couldn't assume anything about it. Certainly not claim to know that it exists. If you believe that is the source, you obviously you have the freedom to believe that. But I don't see good reasons for that. It seems to me like you're sort of evading the linguistic problems that arise by saying, well, this is what I believe or what I have faith in, and therefore it makes sense to me. It's like, what does it mean to create? It means, from my understanding,
for God, He is creation, right? So when you look at finite beings like us, right, we're craftsmen in a sense, right? We gather pre-existing materials and we make something new, right? For us, it wouldn't be creation in that sense, right? What God is that He is creation, and that the universe came from ex nihilo, right? So it didn't take time for the universe to create. God is out of space and time, so that He didn't have to get pre-existing materials, right? He is existence itself. So I mean, you'd either have to maybe accept the definition of a Christian God, right, before you say, that's an impossibility, right? Because if you accept the definition of the Christian God, then that's when these arguments, I mean, are starting to maybe make sense. But it doesn't seem like you like the definition of the Christian God, or just a transcendent being.
Well, I think that's special pleading. I think you're saying that all these things work in this context, but then they don't have to apply to God. My thing is, if you can accept this concept of an ex nihilo, why can't you accept it as perhaps a something being true about, how would I say this, a force that could somehow bring of necessity, that could somehow bring the universe into existence? It doesn't have to be a mind or something that creates.
Is this force in space and time?
Yeah. Again, I don't know. I don't think it makes coherent and linguistic sense to talk about these things outside of that context. It seems to me to be logically incoherent. When you say God created time, that to me sounds like, for God to exist, He would have to rely on time in principle. It just seems like, how can, I guess what I would say is, if you think that God doesn't need a cause, why would you assume that the universe does? And to just say that the universe does because there are some things within the universe that do, seems strange. Because, I mean, apply your own logic for a second. God created everything, so at least according to the Christian view, mm-hmm. everything in His own image, right? He created things in existence.
Humans, yeah.
He created
humans in His own image.
Right. So God created things in the universe that are contingent. He could have created things differently. He created things that are not infinite. He created things that are subject to cause and effect, the same way that we were describing earlier. So God was, as a necessary being, created things that are contingent. So if that's possible for God, I don't see why it couldn't be possible for the universe to have a necessary aspect to it, while also giving birth to things that may be contingent. It's like,
well, you'd have to justify that. You'd have to justify that from a naturalistic standpoint, right? So you have to come up with this idea that the universe is necessary, and you have to give arguments for that. right?
Sure.
To me, there are no arguments to believe that the universe is necessary, and all the arguments to believe that the universe is in fact not necessary. And because it's not necessary, that means it doesn't have to be here, right? So if from a materialistic, naturalistic standpoint, right, you can give me, evidence that the universe is in fact necessary, then of course, right, that would be debunking my argument. But the fact is that where's the evidence leading? It's leading to the fact that the universe is not necessary.
So what you
and because
just
it's
said,
not necessary, then it began to exist.
So what you just said is exactly why I reject your notion of God, because I see no reason.
Why?
Because I don't see any reason to assume that God is necessary. That especially that what is necessary is something that can exist outside of time. Because again, I think it's a logical inconsistency, a linguistic inconsistency, and that
it's not against reason. It's not against reason or logic. It's just beyond it. Right, so we can't comprehend as a finite being. You say it's like it's against reason. Well, it's not against reason. It's just beyond reason.
Well, but I mean that I don't know what that even if something, if by beyond reason you mean beyond our perception, well then to make any claims about it, I think is irrational, because if even if such thing existed, we couldn't know anything about its nature. To me, that seems like an evasion. And again, talking about evidence, you would have to show me evidence that a mind can exist independent of the physical. You would have to show me evidence that the non-physical can interact with the physical. You would have to show me evidence that existence can take place within outside of space and time, and have to show how that can be linguistically sensible. These are all things that, I think whatever failures of my worldview you can point to, and there may be some, I don't think that gives credibility to your worldview, because I think it suffers from similar problems. But I think you're sort of making a special pleading and saying, well, the thing is mysterious, so I don't need to provide the same kind of evidence that I would provide and that you require me to provide. Because when I ask for the same thing, the response is, well, this is beyond our comprehension. Well, if it's beyond our comprehension, then we have no reason to think that it's actual.
Well, it's not. So the thing is, as I said when I started the laying out of the arguments, I said God is available to our natural reason, right? So these arguments are logical arguments, right, for the existence of God and the fact that he is a necessary transcendent source. So you don't have to believe. No, but you don't have to believe that there is a mind outside of space and time, right? But these arguments lead to the mind, the necessary mind that has to be out of space and time. If you understand what I'm saying.
No, I understand what you're saying. I just disagree with it, because I don't think it's actually. I don't think that's actually what you're leading to. I think you're making a fallacy of composition. I think you're making several non sequiturs. I think you're sort of ignoring the linguistic problems that arise from talking about existence outside of space and time. And I think you're also left with the mind-body problem of how one can interact with the other. And ultimately, I don't think any of those issues are really resolved, certainly not logically speaking, by the arguments you're putting forth. But let's just move on to the next thing, because I don't want to get stuck into one. Because you said you had several, so I don't want to.
Okay, great. Sure. So, is this cause temporal? No, because time is as your change, and because the cause of the universe is changeless, it follows that it must be timeless as well. And this was just a continuation from the last one. So I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
Is this cause material? No, and for two reasons. First, we know the cause is changeless, and matter is always changing, at least on the atomic and subatomic levels. Second, if the cause is timeless, then it must also be spaceless or immaterial, because to be in space is to be in time.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would just say what I said earlier. I don't think that you can talk about causes while abandoning the linguistic content in which it makes sense to talk about causes. I don't see a logic in saying existence outside of space and time, or cause outside of space and time, or cause.
So it's not a possibility?
If there is such a thing that somehow could be the case, I can't comprehend it. I think linguistically, but I think linguistically, anybody who claims they do is making a mistake.
So you're saying because you can't comprehend the concept of God, that means that there's no way that it can be a mind outside of space and time? Or
no,
I don't know what you're trying to say.
So let me phrase it this way: I make no claims to certainty. All I have are the tools of logic, epistemology, and language. To me, when you say things like God exists outside of space and time, and something immaterial can cause the material, to me, it's the same as saying a square circle. Conceptually,
well, I'm not saying it can. I'm saying it needs to.
Which again, right. Well, to me, it's like saying it would be the equivalent of saying that a square circle is logically necessary, while in reality, to me, it seems like a logical contradiction. What you're describing and you're saying are logical arguments, to me, seem to be logical contradictions.
But a square circle can't cause anything.
But I'm saying the analogy. I'm not talking about causal power in a sense. I'm saying the analogy is relating to how I say this. The necessity of the concepts. It's, to me, it's a logical contradiction to say that something can exist and can cause outside of the linguistic context in which those words make sense. It would be the equivalent of saying a square circle can exist. Saying that something can exist outside of space and time, to me, as I understand these terms, is equivalent to that type of statement. I'm hopefully people are sort of understanding where it is that we're coming from. I'm not sure that how successfully I'm putting this concept forward, but yeah, you have any other arguments you want to provide?
Yeah, sure. All right, so just to continue on, is the cause limited? No, because that would contradict the cause being pure actuality. To impose a limit on something would be the same as saying there's potential for that thing, which a thing in question can never actualize. That means the cause's causal power cannot be limited, which is another way of saying the cause is all powerful. God brought the universe into existence from nothing, ex nihilo, which means there's nothing that he can't do. And of course, you're not going to, agree because of linguistics, and I understand. But also,
why should there be?
And also, why is it limiting out these arguments for the viewers?
Sorry, you were cutting out for a second. I didn't realize.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say why.
Am I good now?
Why? Yeah, I think so. I can hear you better now. Why is the limitation on the potential of causes a problem for you? Like, why would that be an issue?
Sorry, you were cutting out. I don't know what happened. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, can you hear me okay now? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're good.
So why? So can you? I would just like you to repeat the last part. Like, I'm not sure why the limitations on the potential for causal power would have to be is a problem.
Because that the universe is full of potential and actual, right? The cause would have to be pure actuality, and if it weren't pure actuality, then it would contradict it being limitless, right? Yeah. So because it's pure actuality, it cannot have a limit.
So I'm not sure that I follow that. Why can't pure actuality be? So why can't pure actuality just be whatever is? While still, I mean, when I think of the word actuality, I just think of whatever is the case. But I don't know that conceptually that suggests that what is the case has to have no limits. It seems to me like you're basically setting standards that are somehow escaping any type of testability whatsoever. That you're sort of creating this picture that is how would you say this, immune to any kind of counter because you've defined it as such, which I think is problematic.
No, of course not. I don't know. But you haven't provided any counter. That's the problem.
I think I have, and again, I'll leave it to the audience response. Or
yeah, of course.
Audience.
Yeah, of course, of course.
But I think I have linguistically, on the issue of linguistics, I think as to why these things don't follow. I feel like you're making assumptions at every step that it has to be the case, and I don't see why logically.
Well, that's the point. That's the point of logical arguments, right? So you're saying you don't agree with the definition of God, right? If that's your argument against my logical arguments every single time, I mean, I don't understand why that would debunk per se my arguments that I'm laying out.
Well, I think it's more than that. I think it's not just so much a not disagreeing with not agreeing with the definition of God. I think it's also pointing to the fact that I think you're making a number of fallacies in your attempt to define God. I think you're making a division composition fallacy. I think you're making non sequitur fallacies, and I think you're assuming things about necessity or about actuality that I don't think are contained within the concept itself, which is the problem. It's like, if you want to say that these are the definitions or these are the constants, you would have to, you have to prove those premises to be the case before you can say that your logic is valid.
So for example, so you're saying like what I'm saying is based on assumptions.
It seems
so
to
if
me
I say the universe is consists of pure and pre-actuality and potential, does that mean that I'm assuming that, or is that based on what we know about the universe?
I think with the assumption there, I think, is an assuming that actuality has to mean limitless. I can probably agree with you that the universe is a combination of actuality and maybe, again, I'm not even sure about the potential aspect, because again, when looking at physics, potential assumes the future is yet to come, which is not what modern physics is telling us. So I'm actually not sure that potential even makes sense in the context of what we observe about the universe currently. Now, if that turns out to be wrong in some way and science changes and whatever, but as it currently stands, I'm not sure that potential is even a concept that really makes sense in the larger scheme of things. But yeah, but I mean, I get where you're coming from. I just think that to me, it kind of ends up being like, it ends up being less of an argument from logical necessity and more an argument of this thing is mysterious, and so we can't really comprehend it, but the alternative is impossible, so it must be true. And to me, it's like,
when did I say something about alternative being impossible? What do you mean by that?
Well, no, if you're saying that your God is logically necessary, well, then that implies that all other options are impossible. I'm saying that I've seen no good reason to take what you're saying as logically necessary, because I think it's dependent on certain claims that I think are illogical, and certain fallacies that I think are grounded in assumptions about the universe as opposed to what we can actually derive from the universe. Given the fact that it's already 8, or do you have a lot of other things left that you want to say, or
just a couple more?
Okay, go ahead then.
Just 2 more. Okay,
awesome.
Cool. So, is the cause personal? Yes, and here are 5 reasons to think so. 1, there are only 2 entities that exist: concrete and abstract. But unlike concrete objects, abstract objects like numbers and shapes have no causal power. The cause of the universe, therefore, cannot be an abstract object. 2, there are only 2 kinds of explanations for physical phenomena: scientific ones and personal ones. Scientific explanations consist of physical laws that describe matter, energy, and interactions. For example, the scientific answer to the question, why is that pot boiling, would be the heat is causing the water particles to move quickly and rub against each other, which results in the evaporation of the liquid. A personal explanation would involve the intention of an agent, like the pot is boiling because I wanted tea. The universe coming into existence from nothing can't have a scientific explanation. Science may be able to explain how, but it doesn't explain why. The state of nothingness lacks the matter, energy, and descriptive laws that make up those scientific explanations. Therefore, only a personal explanation of the universe remains. 3. This cause of the universe explains the existence of not just material objects, but also abstract ones like numbers and mathematical truths. But these entities only exist in the mind. So if these objects have necessary existence, they must reside in a necessarily existing mind. 4. Many atheists say they would believe in God if they saw an amputated limb healed through prayer. But this means they would pick a divine explanation for an event rather than simply saying the event has no cause whatsoever. But if our universe came into being just as unexplainably as a healed amputated limb, then atheists should be consistent and conclude that the universe has a divine cause as well. 5. Our universe contains moral properties that only make sense if they have a transcendent moral source. Now, morality as we fully know it only applies to persons. So if the cause of the universe is the source of the moral properties, then that means the source is personal and morally good. And I have one more after, but that was a bunch, so I'll let you respond to that.
So we're going a little bit fast there. I'm not sure that if I missed anything, let me know. I'm not sure that I caught all of that.
Course.
But I think I think most of what you just said is sort of dependent on this assumption that there's a difference between the physical and the abstract objects, right? And
yeah, because abstract objects don't have causal power and concrete objects do.
I don't think abstract objects is a concept that makes any sense. As a physicalist,
so numbers are not abstract objects?
Numbers and logic and language from my worldview are descriptions of the physical world. So it's not that the number 5 exists as a form in any sense, but it's
so do they have?
Sorry, what? You cut out for a second.
Am I good? Can you hear me? Sorry, my Wi-Fi may be a little shaky. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I can. So when I think of math, or when I think of logic, I see these are as descriptive tools that help us understand the relationship among things in the physical universe. It's not that I would say.
But you agree?
Yes. Sorry. Go ahead.
So, but you agree that there are things, right?
No, I wouldn't say
the numbers are
no.
things, right? They're objects.
No. I'm not saying the numbers are things.
So how would you explain what numbers are?
Because numbers are a description. Which arises from our consciousness interacting with the universe. So I wouldn't say that language is a thing. When I use the word tool, I mean it metaphorically. It's a process that consciousness goes through in interacting with the world, and that's where language arises. I mean, you can break it down in physical terms in the sense that, okay, when we think of a word and express a word, there is a physical process taking place there. There are neurons firing, vocal cords being used, that sort of thing. But I don't think of numbers or language as a thing. But I'm, how would I say this? It's a phenomena like all others. All logic is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. So I think that's how I would describe it. I'm not sure if that makes sense to me.
I hear you. Of course,
of
course, my worldview disagrees, but I hear
you. So this brings us to the moral argument, which is, I think, where you and I first interacted.
Sure, yeah.
And so the assumption from the religious is that without God to ground morality, you don't have any grounding where you talk about moral truth. And so I would like to ask you a few questions to try to sort of figure out why I think you think this, and maybe show you why this is not actually reflective of reality. The first question I would like to ask you is, do you believe in consciousness?
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe that there is a nature to consciousness? So the thing, so I'll ask that first.
What do you mean by nature of consciousness?
So do you think that for example, that it's not arbitrary, that even in your worldview, if God created consciousness, it has a nature.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So would you agree that things like states of consciousness include things like suffering or experiences like suffering and well-being?
Sure. Yeah.
So when you think about, for example, wanting to be with God in heaven and wanting to avoid eternal suffering in hell, you agree that this relates to notions of well-being and suffering, and that morality in your worldview relates to that concept of being with God as opposed to being away from God?
Yeah.
Okay, so you accept that morality and it relates to well-being and avoidance of suffering.
Well, I mean, of course, I believe in morality that is good and evil. That there's objective good and there's objective evil.
But you believe this because of the context of well-being and suffering, right? So it is evil to be away from God and to do things that God doesn't want you to do because it's so in His nature, and it is part of the goodness is in the well-being of being with God, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Yeah.
Okay. So now let's look at in terms of neuroscience here. Would you agree that the fact that some people have pain disorders doesn't undermine the concept of pain? So if you put your hand on a stove, and if I put my hand on a stove, that action is going to result in a specific phenomenological experience on both our ends, which is despite the fact that you and I are experiencing this thing subjectively, we can still talk about the experience objectively, correct?
Yeah. No. I mean, no, because if someone had a pain disorder, they wouldn't be able to feel the pain. So I mean, it would be subjective. I mean, let's say I have a pain disorder. I put my hand over a flame, and I say I don't feel the pain, and you say, oh, I feel the pain. Okay, well, it's just a subjective experience.
But would the person with the pain disorder undermine the objectivity for the rest of the people who don't have
pain?
Right.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the pain is there. Pain is a result of nerves.
Okay, so the fact that some people may be neurologically outside of the capacity to experience pain doesn't mean that pain doesn't exist as a concept. Doesn't mean that anything goes all of a sudden when we're talking about pain. You have to understand it in context.
No, of course not. No.
So if you accept everything I just said, I don't see how you can conclude that the morality has to only make sense in the context of God, because all you're doing is adding an extra assumption. If you believe in consciousness, as I do, if you believe in states of suffering and well-being, as I do, if you believe that the fact, the example of the pain disorder doesn't undermine the concept of pain, then you can recognize that the fact that there may be psychopaths out there who can't feel well-being and might be driven to do evil doesn't make morality relative or doesn't undermine well-being and suffering as a concept. I'll just say one last thing. I'm applying for the same reasons as to why you're concerned with a well-being in eternity with God and avoiding suffering for eternity in hell. It's the same concept in a naturalistic approach, that I think consciousness has a nature that we can discover and understand, and the morality relates to navigating a space of moving towards well-being and away from suffering. That's all you need. You need consciousness and states of well-being and suffering to ground morality in nature.
So this is Sam Harris's argument, right? Moral landscape.
More or less. I think he. I wish that in his book he had gone a little bit more into detail about some because I'm not purely what sort of utilitarian, although I don't think he is either. But yes, it's more or less his argument.
Okay, so can I respond?
Of course, yes.
Okay. So in his book, The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Moral Values, Sam Harris argues that science can determine what is morally right and wrong independently of religion or popular opinion. The main thesis of Harris's book is that goodness is just the same as increasing the well-being of conscious creatures. Therefore, action is right, and we ought to do it if it increases well-being. And it is wrong, and we ought not to do it if it decreases well-being. If morality were just about promoting human well-being, then how would it be different than medicine, which is the tool we use to ensure that organisms are healthy or have an optimal well-being? Medicine gives us facts we need to help improve the well-being of organisms. But only morality can tell us that following statement is true. You ought to improve the well-being of conscious creatures. That's not a scientific fact you would find in a medical textbook. It's a fact you would bring to the book before reading it. What makes Harris's proposal so seductive is that it seems obviously true, right? Like, yes, it is bad to cause misery for no good reason. Yes, it is good to help human beings thrive. Yes, we ought to do good and avoid evil. But the problem is that although we all certainly agree that these things are true, we don't agree on why they are true. The theologian may show evidence from God's commands or apply principles of reason to what some call the natural law to show that these facts are true. A secular philosopher may appeal to certain principles of morality, such as intuition or brute facts. But if Harris claims that science can prove these statements true, then he must present scientific evidence for this claim. In the context of his work, it seems that his assumption that we ought to improve the well-being of conscious creatures is a philosophical position, not a scientific one. In fact, Duke University philosopher...
Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. Finish what you were saying.
Okay. So in fact, Duke University philosopher Alex Rosenberg, author of The Atheist Guide to Reality, says that although Harris correctly explains how science can resolve moral disputes, he mistakenly believes that science can show the resulting moral argument to be true, correct, or right. It can't. Science has no way to bridge the gap between is and ought. In other words, science can show us what helps humans reproduce or achieve certain positive ends, but it does not show that we have an obligation to help humans flourish or achieve a maximal state of well-being. In a debate with William Lane Craig, Harris asked the audience to imagine a world where people experience a maximum amount of misery. He then said that in this hypothetical world, if the word bad applies anywhere, it applies here. Harris then extrapolated from the example to make the claim that since it's obvious that morality involves increasing goodness or the well-being of conscious creatures, then according to him, the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. In this example, Harris confuses the moral and non-moral use of the word good. Yes, it's good for conscious creatures not to be in maximum misery, but it's also good for trees not to be in a state of maximum aridity. This doesn't prove that it is morally good to water trees, or immoral not to water them, even though such an act is good for the tree, or it's good for an assassin to have a rifle that won't jam, and that it will make his task much easier to accomplish, but that doesn't make his task morally good. Harris needs a further argument to show that just because suffering is bad for humans, it follows that it is morally good to alleviate human suffering. After all, the police are bad for assassins, but we think that is a good thing. Finally, morality doesn't seem to be the same thing as flourishing of conscious creatures. Harris betrays this distinction at the very end of his book when he says that it is also conceivable that a science of human flourishing could be possible, and yet people could be made equally happy by very different moral impulses. Perhaps there is no connection between being good and feeling good, and therefore no connection between moral behavior, as generally conceived, and subjective well-being. In this case, rapists, liars, and thieves would experience the same depth of happiness as saints. It would no longer be an especially moral landscape. Rather, it would be a continuum of well-being upon which saints and sinners would occupy equivalent peaks. If Harris is trying to prove that goodness and increasing well-being are the same thing, or they're identical, then he has severely undermined his own case with the previous concession. That is because if two things are identical, then there is no possible world where those two things aren't the same. 2 + 2 is identical to 4, because in any world that is conceivable, they are always the same thing. Even in a universe with just one hydrogen atom, 2 + 2 would still be identical to 4. But consider the relationship between myself, Colton, and the driver of Colton's car. These two things are almost always the same, me, but they're not identical because my mom enjoys driving the car. There's other people who drive my car. So when Harris describes a possible world where evil people are the happiest overall, he has proven that well-being and moral goodness are not identical. And if they aren't identical, then they aren't the same thing. Therefore, increasing well-being is not what makes goodness good. Harris is right that we could develop a scientific way to ensure conscious creatures flourish, but there's no scientific fact that we could discover which says we are obligated to help them. or any creature flourish. There must be something else that constitutes moral goodness and is the source of our moral duties. The theist believes that only God can be that which is identical to the good as well as the source of our duties, because God is by his very nature a perfectly loving person and the ultimate paradigm of the good. So I would say Sam Harris is based on entire assumption that it is good to increase the well-being of creatures, but molecules can't tell us that, right? So you say it's good to increase the well-being of it's good to increase the well-being of creatures, right? But you can't give me a reason why it is good. So that's what I would have to say about Sam Harris's moral landscape.
So not only I gave you a reason, but it's a reason you agreed with in the beginning of the conversation, because the only thing that you need to examine is truths about phenomenology. You're defining God as good by saying God is the nature of good. I'm simply saying the same thing about what constitutes the phenomenology of consciousness. The hypothetical about I would agree with you if it was the case the psychopaths could do what we would think as immoral actions and then experience the same type of well-being. But all of the evidence points to the exact opposite. These are not people that are well-adjusted, happy individuals experiencing the heights of well-being that are possible. These are highly neurotic, reacting on impulses that many wish they could control. This is not what we see in the evidence of when there's a lot of information out there on serial killers and that type of stuff. This is and I think most problems in philosophy can be reduced to a problem of language. What do we mean by good? Okay, what sense does it make to say is goodness good? It doesn't. The concept is contained in the descriptor. When I say good, I'm referring to a state of being. It doesn't need any additional metaphysical justification. It's a description of something that is a state of affairs, something that is a matter of fact. When I started the questions to you about consciousness, every step of the way you were agreeing, yes, consciousness exists, consciousness has a nature, there's such a thing as suffering, there's such a thing as well-being. In what sense, if those things all exist, does it make sense to say, is suffering bad or is goodness good? These are descriptors of those things.
Because it's based on assumption that increasing the well-being of someone is a good thing, right? So we should challenge those assumptions. Okay. So let me give you a thought experiment. So you say we should increase the well-being of creatures. That would be maybe your definition of morality. Yes.
Yeah, and I would say that it's not an assumption. It's a reflection of what is true about phenomenology.
Okay, so let's say you heard this one. I texted it to you. So let's say we could reprogram, right, babies when they're young so that they grow up and their only source of happiness, their only source of well-being comes from blindly obeying others. Under your worldview, that's okay because that increases their well-being. So there's nothing wrong with that.
No, this is a similar type of utilitarian fallacy that's similar. It's along the lines of, if you could vivisect one person to save 10, that would be the moral thing to do, given the sort of moral mathematics in that context. I would say no, because you have to think about the additional factors that play into well-being. Like, how would I say this? It's
but
why most people.
Wrong.
No, I'll explain to you why I think it's wrong. Because I'm not talking about pure, like, momentary chemistry. Like, if I had a choice, for example, between living out my life or taking a pill that sends me into the matrix, I wouldn't take the pill that sends me into the matrix, because part of what I mean by well-being is sort of, it's being, how do I say this, in relation to reality. It's not wanting to create an illusion.
Why is that a good thing? But why is that a good thing?
Why is being connected to reality a good thing?
Yeah, because you say just the increase of well-being is important. So what if we could maximize the increase of well-being? Why is that wrong? You're saying it's wrong.
No, I'm saying,
but you're not giving me a reason as to why it is wrong.
No, I'm saying that being connected to reality is intrinsically valuable.
Is that a fact?
I would say it's self-evident. Yes, because when I'm
So,
talking about
so how do you justify that fact?
because when I'm talking about well-being, I'm not talking about mere pleasure, right? Like I'm talking about the totality of possible human experience. I'm not talking about just like getting high and feeling feeling good. Given the choice between having my autonomy and experiencing a height of well-being, or experiencing a height of well-being while under the influence of some kind of mind control, why would anybody choose the second one when you could have a height of well-being that retains things that we value and we value intrinsically?
We're talking about babies, so they don't have a choice, but we have a choice to give them the best life possible, the best well-being possible, pleasure, and everything else that you say well-being consists of. There's nothing wrong with that under your worldview, and you can't justify that. That's what I'm trying to get at.
No, the way I'm trying to justify it is by saying that the best life possible is one that includes autonomy in that context. And,
why?
What do you mean?
Well, why? Why is that a good thing? Why is
think
experiencing reality a good thing?
I mean, it seems pretty self-evident that.
But it deserves intelligible answers. What I'm trying to say, it's not like, so it goes back to this universe. You say the universe is just the way it is. Well, no, that's not true, right? Because it deserves an explanation. This question of why it's good to increase well-being, why it's good to experience reality, is like me saying, why is that triangle green? So you have to give me an answer to why is that triangle green. So it's not like, why is that triangle has three sides?
So let me try to phrase it this way. I would say that it is a fact of our psychology, and it is a fact of I would say consciousness as a whole, that we're bound to value as a matter of what it means to have autonomy. What is the experience of having autonomy? What is the experience of even going through certain types of suffering to then learn and come out of it with higher states of well-being? These are all things that we value because of what the experience of those things is constituted of.
So you're justifying morality, your morality, based on experience and feelings?
Not experience and feelings in the emotion or like subjective type of description. I'm grounding it in truth of phenomenology, truth of what is true about consciousness, what it means to be an entity that can experience. But I don't mean just like, oh, I feel something. I'm talking about consciousness as having a nature, and as such, there are certain things that are ultimately, there does come a point where we can't get underneath the why. Like, why are the laws of physics what they are? Why is consciousness what it is as opposed to something else? I don't think that's a question that I don't believe that's a question that we can answer. Or if we can, doesn't mean that it doesn't have an answer. But I think it's a mistake to assume that we have an answer, and it's a mistake to assume that we necessarily will have an answer. Ultimately, what matters in this context, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that it is the state of affairs is such that this is what the nature of consciousness is. It's why most people would rather not live in the matrix, and they've done surveys on this. Like, I can send you links privately as to why as to why it's the case that even if you were to tell somebody, you could live your so-called perfect life, but it would all be an illusion. None of it would be real. You would really actually be in a dark room deteriorating, but you wouldn't know it in your head. Most people would choose not to be in the matrix. Why is that? Well, it seems like it's something.
Sure. That's their.
So, huh?
Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that captures a certain psychological fact about what it means to be a conscious being in this existence. Now, why it's the case that some of these things are what they are, I acknowledge is an open question. Why is it that the makeup of what constitutes suffering as opposed to well-being is what it is? Why are the laws of physics what they are? Yes, I agree. Some of this stuff may be open-ended, and I'm willing to admit that. But all that matters for our purposes right now is to at least show you that it is the case that well-being and suffering exist, and it is the case that we are intrinsically we care about it, because that's what it means to be a conscious being that can experience. The badness of suffering, the goodness of well-being is self-contained in the meaning of the experience. So for the same reason, and by the way, if this is a problem for my worldview, it's a problem for yours, because I can throw it back to you and say, well, why should you care about being with God for eternity, as opposed to being in heaven being with God in heaven for eternity and being in hell suffering for eternity. It's always a value judgment you're making in the context of phenomenology in either worldview. Just that I think you're making an extra assumption by believing a God, when I can just say it's nature regardless.
Okay, so you say it's nature regardless. Okay, so I challenge the assumption of increasing well-being is a good thing. So what about, so you say suffering is a bad thing, right? So suffering for no apparent reason. So if someone went up to punch someone, that would be a bad thing. You would say that would be a bad thing?
I mean, generally speaking, sure. I think there are contexts in which, this is why Harris calls it a landscape. There may be contexts where certain types of suffering is necessary to build character and to then experience higher peaks of well-being. But it depends on the kind of suffering. It depends on the type of thing it is. So
how would you define evil?
I would define evil as needless suffering from which, how would I say this? It is a context in which all you're doing is causing suffering, and to yourself and to somebody else. So it is.
So we know that's bad and unpleasant, right? But I'm trying to get at, under your worldview, you can't justify why that's evil, right? So animals cause each other suffering, but would you call that evil?
Well, I think the way that I justify it is by pointing to phenomenology being objectively the case. Like, it's not arbitrary. If I can point to phenomenology as having a nature, then that's, I can ground that in nature. Now, in the context of animals, the difference is that they can't self-reflect on what it is they're doing. They're purely acting on instinct.
But under your worldview, we're just animals. So why is it? So why are we different than other animals that cause each other pain? Why is it bad to cause suffering?
I think the difference is that we have the tools to avoid that type of behavior. We have the self-reflection, and our consciousness is developed enough, and we have the intelligence enough to be able to.
So you say consciousness has arose from evolution over the years?
Well, I think it's in part. I wouldn't say it's just evolution. I think it's I would say it's also physical law, and I think there is a evolutionary component to phenomenology, but I don't think it's reducible to evolution. Although there are things like evolutionary psychology, which also shows, even in animals, altruistic behaviors. So there is some degree in which even animals have certain what become in us moral intuitions. Like when we're talking about,
but evolution is about survival of the fittest. I mean, it's not about the survival of the most moral.
No, but what we find in observing the natural kingdom is that to some degree, while yes, animals have destructive instincts as well, cooperation is also a factor that leads to survival of the fittest. It's not purely the strongest that can, destroy every other living thing. No, there are aspects to what is meant by survival of the fittest that involve what we would call moral intuitions. Things like altruism.
Aren't there certain things that we as a species can do to per se survive better? Aren't there like from a genetic perspective, aren't there evil things that we could do that would help our species?
No, I would say no. I think ultimately in the larger, when you look at the larger picture, there is no context in which, unless you're like defending yourself from someone trying to kill you.
Okay, so
I would say,
so
I'll just answer your question in this way, that altruism and helping others and caring about others is sort of automatically going to lead to higher states of well-being and survival. And we can observe this.
So do you agree that genetic diseases hold our species back from passing on good genes?
So,
in evolutionary, do you believe that that genetic diseases hold back our species from passing on good genetic genes to our children, to our offspring, from a genetic from evolutionary standpoint? Okay, so then what is wrong with forcibly sterilizing people who have genetic diseases? What's wrong with that from your standpoint?
Because if you remember, I'm not only limiting my worldview on evolution. Phenomenology is partially related, but it's independent. Most people care more about the quality of their life than how long they live. So I'm not just talking about, for example, again, I can use the same example I gave earlier. If I was talking about pure survival, just survival, it would make sense to take out the organs of one person to save 5. But you have to also keep in mind of the consequences that would result psychologically and phenomenologically speaking of living in that kind of society. So you can still retain a utilitarian approach while also recognizing that some things, are still immoral, even though intuitively the mathematics might not make sense. I'm not only basing my morality on pure survival. I'm also talking. You're
saying so some things are so immoral, right? How can molecules, how can laws of physics tell us what is right and wrong?
Because
you're saying what is so immoral?
Because consciousness arises from physics. We have no reason to assume that consciousness and its nature isn't independent.
Then what's the difference? Then what's the difference between murdering someone and praising someone? On a law of physics standpoint, there's no difference between the two.
Of course there is. There's a completely opposing phenomenological experience there, which is why, it is a difference between saying this is a good experience, phenomenologically speaking, and a bad one. It's what it means to say it's a distinction between suffering and well-being. It's why.
Exactly. So it's just subjective morality. It's just subjective morality.
No, it's not a different morality. It's the foundation.
So how do you justify your worldview? How do you justify morality on your naturalistic worldview?
By observing the differences in phenomenological experience from one behavior to another. When somebody hurts another person, what we see is not well-being produced. What we see is suffering.
But why is well-being why is well-being a good thing?
Because it is self-contained in the concept. It's all that it could be meant by goodness. Words are descriptors. They're not abstract objects or forms existing in floating around. Language is description of different states of being. Well-being is by definition good. It's the same thing. And by the way, you agree with this because you're doing the same thing, but the difference is that you're calling it God. You're doing the same thing.
I explained to you why Harris undermined his own argument because he said that well-being and goodness was the same thing, but it's not the same thing.
I don't see the rejection of that argument as being successful. It would only be successful if you could show that regardless of behavior, you could experience well-being anyway. So if we could observe that you could rape somebody and feel the same type of well-being that we would call moral in terms of helping somebody, well then you'd be right. But that's not what we see when we actually look at the evidence. We see that there's a clear distinction.
What if there was someone who raped another person but it brought about the most well-being of the world?
Well then that's
a bad thing.
If that was true, then my foundation would crumble, and I would acknowledge that I would abandon this approach because it would be proven wrong. That's not what we see.
You just no, but you just admitted to that. So let's say a tyrannical dictator was raped, was killed, right? Was raped and killed, and it freed thousands and thousands of people, right? It brought about the most well-being. Why is that a bad thing? You just said that it wasn't a bad thing, but we know that rape and murder is not a good thing.
You could, when you look at, first of all, you could eliminate a dictator without engaging in worse moral behavior. You could, now there may be contexts, and I'm not a complete pacifist. I do think there are contexts in which I would never claim murder to be good, but it may be a lesser evil than allowing a dictator to continue to exist. So there is some context in which we can compare and contrast certain behaviors and say one is preferable to another. But there's no context in which you would need to rape a dictator. You could eliminate the dictator from power.
Okay, but it's just a hypothetical. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm just saying it's a hypothetical.
No, I know, but
you told me that if it brings about the most well-being, then it's okay. It should be done. So for example, bring about the most well-being of our species from an evolutionary standpoint. Sterilizing people with genetic diseases, forcibly sterilizing them is okay, right? Reprogramming babies at a young age to grow up where they become blind slaves and that's their only source of happiness is okay, right? Rape and murder to bring about the most well-being is okay, right? Under your worldview, these are things that you just said that would be good because it's bringing about the most well-being. Even Sam Harris said, if it brings about the most well-being, we should do it. So why not become a utilitarian society?
Because I think because you're strawmanning what I'm actually saying. Because in fact I responded to every one of those examples the opposite, and I gave reasons as to why, in my worldview, sterilizing people will not actually result in the higher states of well-being, because it's not just about survival. It's also about quality of life. I brought two concepts.
But the thing is, why is quality of life important though, under your perspective?
Because it is contained. Right. Because it is sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Good is a descriptor of a phenomenological state. So it is good by definition. It is contained in all that we could mean by goodness and evil. The same way that in your worldview, you could only define those terms as being reflective of the nature of God. So why is being with God in heaven forever good? It's definitionally the case. You're defining it as such because you're saying that's goodness is God's nature. You're doing the same thing.
Well, no, I mean, no. I believe in objective facts because I believe that God, that morality flows from God. God is all good. God is a perfectly good source, right? So when I say murder is wrong, no matter what context, it is wrong, and that's a fact, right? You can't justify it by your naturalistic standpoint. That's what I'm trying to say. You can't say that murder is an evil thing as an objective fact, and you can't justify that from a naturalistic standpoint.
I will say I've justified it entirely when looking at what the nature of phenomenology is, and your justification is based on assumption that well-being of a person is a good thing. That personal experience of a person is a good thing. It's based on an entire assumption. I don't think it's based on assumption. I think it's based on a self-evident truth and an observation of what it means to actually be a conscious being that can experience. As far as murder, let me just want to say one thing before I forget. As far as murder and these kind of things, all I get from I mean, I'm not applying this to you, but because I don't know exactly your complete beliefs here, but I think it's the other way around. I think people, when they use religion, you look at the God of the Old Testament, murder and destruction happens constantly, and yet we're told that we should, the context of the time matters, the context of the situation matters. Why does the Bible in certain parts condemn slavery, in other parts supports it? Because
this is an argument. This is an argument against the Bible, not against God, right?
No,
so
you don't have to believe.
Yeah, so you don't have to believe in the God in the Bible. Don't believe in the God of the Bible. But what I'm saying is that God, this transcendent source that I was talking about earlier, who is a necessary cause of all the contingent things of the universe and whatnot and so forth, right, is also an all perfect, all good God, right? So that morality source is stemmed from him, and and the morality is a source from him, right? So you don't have to believe in the Bible. That's an argument against the Bible. It's not against a transcendent source.
But do you not recognize that you're already using a definition of good when you say God is good? Like you're already doing the same thing that I'm doing?
Because his nature is good.
So
that's the whole entire definition of God.
Yeah, but goodness is an adjective. So if God's nature is good, why can't you recognize that goodness can be a state of experience that then we can talk about as good or etc.? Why can't you notice the same thing can be true about nature in general? That, like, you know, goodness in my context means experience X, you know, experience of well-being. That is how I'm defining goodness, as opposed to experience Y, which is suffering. It's self-contained and self-evident in the experience. Again, I feel like at this point we're sort of going to talk in circles, because I think for some reason we're sort of missing each other in this.
Well, here, so I do want to share a quote with you.
Sure.
It's from Atheist Robin Ep.11. I think it's French. I don't know. He rejects objective moral truths, but he admits this would be a plausible position if objective moral truths did exist. He writes, unlike humans, God is a source of moral value. That is, God's goodness is in part consists of the fact that he is the basis of ethics. Since it is not trivial that God plays such a role, it cannot be trivial that God is good. In fact, it is highly morally significant because it points to the source of moral obligation. Asking, is an action good because it is what God commands, or is it what God commands because the action is good? It should leave us puzzled, for they are the same thing. God's command and the good itself flow from God's perfect, loving, and unchanging nature. So you could say, how do you know God's nature is good? And this is like asking, how do you know a meter is 39.4 inches long? The reason a meter is that long is because it's just how long the meter bar, the bar of platinum or iridium in France is. That bar is what it means to be a meter long. In the same way that God's nature is what it means to be the good.
So again, I'm saying the exact same.
And what I'm saying is, in your worldview, you can't justify.
No, I think no.
But if it's not from a transcendent source, then it's just subjective assumptions.
No, not at all. You don't need a transcendent source to look at the state of affairs of phenomenology and the state of affairs of what nature is. The same way that you acknowledged earlier that a pain. This is why I asked the question about the pain disorder. This is why I asked you about whether or not you believed in consciousness, whether or not you believed that consciousness had an objective nature, whether or not suffering and well-being were part of that objective nature. If you said yes to all of those questions, if you say yes to all those questions, you should be able to logically see how I can justify calling the experience good. Like you said, it's definitionally the case. The same way that you're using the word good for God, I'm saying the word good for the state of phenomenological experience.
So I'll end with this. So I gave you reasons why Harris's argument undermines itself, because well-being and goodness is not the same thing. And also you say the experience of the pain disorder, of someone with a pain disorder, or me without a pain disorder feeling the flame, right? Your worldview can't justify why that pain is a bad thing, why we shouldn't inflict that type of pain. That's just experience. I mean, what about experience is important, right? But you can't justify why that is a bad thing to forcibly put someone over a flame and have them hurt, because it's just about experience. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that morality is unchanging, right? If morality is unchanging, there's certain facts about the universe relating to morality that can't come from anything except a transcendent source, because it's not subject to change.
Right. So the way in which I've described phenomenology is not subject to change either. And I think I've entirely justified it. And why would it be bad to put force somebody's hand on a flame, simply by looking at what phenomenology is, what it means to use the words bad and good, where it is that those, if I think that I have a moral responsibility towards people as opposed to towards rocks, because I don't think rocks can suffer. Now, that's something that I could be potentially wrong about, okay? But these moral notions arise from concepts of well-being and suffering in both of our worldviews. I think all you need to ground it, you just said it's just experience. Well, yeah, but so what? It's not just arbitrary. It's not just experience. It's looking at the nature of experience. It's looking at the consequences of behavior on potential phenomenological experiences and everything that constitutes that. It's looking at language and words as descriptors of certain states of being, and why it is that it makes sense to call well-being good and suffering bad. I will leave it to the audience watching right now to make their own judgments as to who put forward the most successful argument here. But I will say that I very much appreciate you coming on, and I hope I didn't, I gave you, time to speak, and that you felt like this was a fair exchange.
No, I felt like I got more than enough time to speak. I felt like I spoke too much at times. So thank you for allowing me to share my perspective.
At times, I accidentally spoke over you because you're lagging a lot, and sometimes I thought you were done speaking because it hadn't quite caught up with the video yet. So unfortunately, Mike is having some technical issues. So let me just ask him. I'm trying because I've never actually ended the show myself. Usually he's the one in the background doing all the technical stuff. But I hope everybody enjoyed this episode, and I hope maybe you can come back sometime if you're willing to discuss things again in the future.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you came on.
Good. Thanks for having me on.
I think we have another episode on Wednesday, and then I think on Friday, T-Jump is going to come on to discuss morality again and some other things. And so, yeah, I will leave it at that. Thanks everybody for tuning in. If you like what you see, please subscribe, like the video, whatever. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your night. So take care, everyone.